Thanks for staying with us. Now, the National Economic Development and Labour Council has agreed on workplace COVID-19 vaccine guidelines. They're yet, however, to be signed and gazetted by the Employment and Labour Minister. Now, let's talk to conflict and employment dispute specialist Vlok just about what the arguments and the debates are around this, because there's still a lot up in the air. Andre, thank you so much for joining us. He's joining us virtually from Gqeberha this morning. Now, you've been involved in an ongoing debate on social media about this issue specifically. Now, of course, if this was all black and white, it would have been easy to apply. But that would mean somebody like you, who's in the business of conflict and employment dispute management, wouldn't have any work to do, and it certainly wouldn't make things interesting. A no jab, no job policy, is that what we're looking at here in South Africa, or is it more complex than that?
It's far more complex than that, Marcel. I think we all tend to, or certainly the marketplace tend towards voluntary vaccination. Most of the big employers that I've spoken to, they certainly want to see that. In a perfect world, we'd have that, but of course it's not that simple.
And now, some of the things on either side, I mean, you can look at examples set internationally. That's what we've been doing all along since this pandemic started. I saw that in Australia, in healthcare facilities, in places like Victoria, they already have healthcare workers having to stand down if they're not vaccinated. But that's a healthcare workplace where you can actually make the argument that it is indeed necessary for them to be vaccinated, especially if they work in places where you look after the aged. But what about workplaces that aren't in the health space, because they could open up themselves to issues like unfair dismissal and anti-discrimination laws, which are very strict and straightforward here in South Africa as well?
It's a wonderfully complex debate, and it would deepen and get a lot more interesting in the next few weeks, I gather. We see that, as you mentioned, in Australia. We see it in the UK. The concept's not that strange. It's starting to be implemented. I'm working for a number of national employers who have decided that a mandatory vaccination policy is the best for them and for everyone. So that's what we're going to need to implement now.
So if you implement it in that fashion, where then does that leave somebody who perhaps has health issues with the vaccine, or religious objections, or constitutional objections? How are you preparing those clients of yours in the employment space to deal with this coming back at them from some employees?
I think it's with all strict policies, there will have to be exceptions. A policy, a dynamic policy would certainly need to make provision for those exclusions. We already know, even at this, with the state of science and our knowledge of COVID at this stage, that there are valid exclusions, allergies. There's quite a list of exclusions, and any such policy should respect that and make provision for that.
Where does this leave the employee? We've been speaking quite a bit about where it leaves the employer. Where does it leave the employee? And we think, especially here in South Africa, where labour is very organised, we have very strong workers' unions as well. Where does it leave them in terms of their rights? If they come to work one day and they're told, listen, unless you take this jab in your arm, we can't allow you access to the building because, of course, if COVID hits in our office, it has an impact on our turnover, etc., etc. Where does that leave the employees in terms of their rights?
Well, certainly the way we're managing the process from here on, it would not be a very sudden situation. There'd be, at best, for the employer, there'd be a rollout period. There'd be, depending on how you get there, which argument you're going to use to get to that policy, and there are several arguments, there'd certainly be a period for consultation, for counselling, for advising. Of course, with the bigger companies, we're going to consult with unions as well.
Of course, we've now been speaking about things like anti-discrimination laws, the constitution, religious beliefs, health beliefs, and that kind of thing. We also have this element of the anti-vaxxers, who, of course, have been very loud, especially on social media platforms. Do you think those kinds of arguments will have any hold, as it were, when it comes to this kind of thing, when it does become an issue here in South Africa?
Speaking for my consultancy, Marcella, I'm certainly not going we're not going to get stuck in a factual debate. That's not the way that you convince people. As we see on social media, we could have this anti-vax argument for the next year, and you're not really going to convince people at this stage, at least, with the state of science. People believe anti-vaccine approaches for different reasons, and they're not always factual, and we shouldn't make the mistake of getting involved in just... Obviously, the science needs to be out there, and we certainly include that in the process, but those reluctances and those objections will be addressed in other ways as well.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Indeed, I don't think it's the last time we'll be having this conversation. Andre Vlok is a conflict and employment dispute specialist. Thank you so much for joining us. Just some insight in what will be an ongoing discussion, and indeed an important discussion that people are having in the workplace, just in terms of employer-employee relations right now.
Yeah, and as we know, in South Africa, when it comes to employee-employer relations, for the vast majority of the workforce, that's never a simple and easy discussion to have. And one of those issues, of course, is going to be if, and I'll do this very quickly, if a company wants you to have a jab, but there aren't enough vaccines for the employees, who's going to be allowed in, who's going to have to stay outside? What does that mean for employment equity and employment rights? It's a big issue in South Africa, and we'll keep having those conversations. Now,